Everyone, Michael Shermer here. This is our first AMA for the Science Salon, Skeptics Science Salon. By way of background, we've never done one of these. I've never done an AMA, and I was a little hesitant to do so. Not sure if anybody really cared what I had to say about a lot of these different topics. So I was relieved and pleased that we got hundreds of responses. So perhaps we'll do this again. Just by way of background, as you know, we've been doing Science Salon Dialogues, which evolved out of our Caltech Science Lecture Series that we started in April of 1992. We had over 300 of those events, and then in 2015 we transitioned to doing dialogues, mainly because I thought it was a more productive way of exchanging information and thinking deeply about these different topics, convinced in part by Richard Dawkins' emphasis on these conversations rather than canned lectures that he started doing, and also by doing a lot of podcasts myself as a guest. And I thought these are far more productive than just a canned lecture that authors typically give. And so then we started doing our own podcast, the Science Salon podcast, and now we'll try our hand at AMA. So ask me anything. Well, we got hundreds of responses. I've grouped them into categories. Obviously, I can't answer all of them, but science and skepticism, God, Jesus, and religion, free will, of course, Jordan Peterson, naturally, human nature, the future of humanity, and miscellaneous. So let's get right to it. In our first category of science and skepticism, my old friend, Chick D'Arpino, who I wrote about in The Believing Brain, actually is in my chapter 1. He writes, using the English language, what else would I use here? Please define the word science with the least amount of words. Okay, well, so I defined it in my very first book with semantic precision, my book, Why People Believe Weird Things, as a set of methods designed to describe and interpret observed or inferred phenomenon, past or present, aimed at building a testable body of knowledge open to rejection or confirmation. So unpacking that, it's a set of methods. It's a verb. It's something you do, not just something to be. It's not a noun. It's more like a verb. And those methods are designed to describe and interpret. So, of course, we describe nature, but the facts just don't speak for themselves, so we have to interpret them. And observed or inferred phenomenon, things we can actually see or things that we can't see, but their presence is inferred, like black holes or atoms. A past or present, I throw that in there because we're not just studying the present nature, but also the past. I think history can and is a science. You think of geology, archaeology, astronomy, cosmology, these are historical sciences, so we should throw that in there, past and present. And the whole point is to build a testable body of knowledge. Testable is the key. Anybody can build a body of knowledge. Mythology and religion builds bodies of knowledge, but they're not testable. And if they are, then they're in the realm of science. And the whole point in the final clause, open to rejection or confirmation, as Popper described it, conjecture and refutation, or the falsifiability of a claim is what makes it science. So we have to be able to either reject it or confirm that it's possibly true. So that's it. Set of methods designed to describe and interpret observed or inferred phenomenon, past or present, aimed at building a testable body of knowledge open to rejection or confirmation. So there you go, Chick. That's kind of a long-winded answer, but science is not that simple to describe. Okay, Robert Moskowitz writes, why do skeptics make such a big point of attempting to refute assertions and experiences that are not presently susceptible to scientific explanation? Your approach seems to be that if science can't explain a phenomenon, it must not exist and can be fully explained as some kind of misperception or failure to understand what's really going on. What's wrong with the approach that if science can't explain a phenomenon, it may nevertheless exist, and science just hasn't grown enough yet to find the explanation for it? Okay, so first of all, it's not just that we're out to debunk everything. Science and skepticism is just a way of knowing and testing claims. And if they turn out to be true or supported, then we're willing to accept and believe them. But science is set up in a way to be conservative in this sense that we start with the null hypothesis. That is, your claim we assume to be not true until proven otherwise. The main reason for this is because there's so many claims that people make, including claims by scientists that turn out to be wrong. So this, again, Popper's conjecture and refutation, lots of conjectures. Just throw stuff out there, boom, 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 you see what sticks, test it and see what's left standing after tests. And what's left standing, we can't say it's true, in capital T, but we can say so far it's not been falsified, so therefore our confidence in it can grow. Now, as for not being able to explain a phenomenon, it depends what it is. I mean, if you say, well, you can't prove that unicorns don't exist or God doesn't exist or whatever, yes, we can't prove a negative, but the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. So I don't need to say that it doesn't exist. I don't need to prove that something doesn't exist. The claimant needs to prove, or at least argue, that it does exist and give it the best evidence they have. So what's wrong with the approach that if science can't explain it, it may nevertheless exist, is that there's no way to test it. It doesn't get us anywhere. There's nothing to do with that particular claim. On the subject of UFOs, an unnamed person asks, why are you against the possibility of UFOs? The scientific community in general, he means, not just me. How can we know everything that is out there in the universe? Okay, we can't. And I'm not against the possibility of UFOs. In fact, most scientists are not against it. They are completely open to the idea. There's a whole branch of science, SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the SETI Institute being just one, run by professional astronomers and physicists who think the possibility is good that there are extraterrestrial intelligences out there somewhere, but that doesn't mean that there are. It's just the idea that they could be, and it's worth the search, so why not? Now, it's important to make a distinction between two questions. One, are aliens out there? And two, have they come here? Now, most scientists think chances are pretty good there's some kind of life out there, possibly even intelligent life in the cosmos. But most scientists are skeptical that they've come here. This is the so-called Fermi paradox. Where is everybody? If life pops up naturally by the laws of nature, they should be all over the place. We don't see them, so where are they? Of course, ufologists think that the answer is that they are here, and they're crashing in flying saucers. They're living as lizard people in New Mexico or whatever. And the problem the SETI people have, of course, is that we haven't been searching all that long, and it's a vast cosmos. So the chances of us actually encountering a UFO, an extraterrestrial intelligence, is very, very, very slim. And that's why the search is done by looking for radio signals, for example, or lasers, or some kind of trace evidence that around a star, for example, there's a Dyson sphere, some kind of solar array constructed that's not obviously naturally created. Something like that is the best hope we have for actually making some kind of discovery along those lines. But as we know, it's the universe is so vast that the chances of making contact are slim, so we can't know that there's nothing out there. Bart Lewis asks about the limitations of our imagination. The honeybee is quite an intelligent little creature, but no one would suggest that it is capable of ruminating on the foibles of the human creatures about them. But apparently we humans feel that our intellectual apparatus has no similar physical limitation. Aren't there physical concepts we simply cannot imagine? Well, Bart, if there are, how would we know? Because if we could imagine them, then we wouldn't have to deal with this question, right? So there's as the famous line goes, there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know that we don't know. And so by definition, there's really nothing to say about that other than, yes, of course, it's entirely possible that there's other laws of nature we have yet to discover, something like that. Very unlikely in physics, I'm told, by physicists. But not impossible. And of course, there could be things outside of nature, but then how would we know? Because we're part of nature. So this really gets to a deeper epistemological question about how we know anything and the limitation of our brains. Now, In a recent column in Scientific American, I wrote about the Mysterians, the people that believe that there's certain mysteries about the universe that can never be solved. They're just the limitations of language, cognition, how we think about these things means we can never know them. I put three of those: God, free will, and consciousness. And anyway, I'll address that and somebody else asks about that or a later question. But for now, that's the problem we have. Of course, if we had a brain 100 times the size of our brain, it's entirely possible that there's things that we would become aware of that we're not aware of now. But that said, that's not the brain we have. Okay, Elizabeth Nees asks, what's your current opinion on repressed memories, that is, memories of childhood sexual abuse that emerge later in childhood? I'm skeptical. We've been writing about this since the mid-1990s when the recovered memory movement was really taking off and gaining a lot of popularity, and was actually causing a lot of problems, legal problems. There were people that were being convicted for molestation based on nothing other than the recovery of an allegedly repressed memory of childhood sexual abuse. These are adult, mostly women, who are in therapy for whatever reason, and the therapist believes that in this Freudian notion of repressed memories that can be recovered through these sort of therapeutic techniques of teasing out these memories, which we believe now is pretty clear that these are concocted or constructed or confabulated memories. These are things that didn't actually happen, that somebody imagines could happen by the leading questions of the therapist, and then before you know it, you have a full-fledged memory of it. The problem is memory is not like a video camera that records the scenes and stores them on your hard drive, and then when you recall them, it plays them back in the theater of your mind, and your little homunculus in there watches the screen and reports to some other part of your brain what it's watching, and then somehow looks and goes, oh my gosh, I completely forgot. Look, I was molested when I was 5 or whatever. That's not how memory works. It's constantly edited and changed, and so we know that it can be contaminated just by asking questions a certain way. This is the research of Elizabeth Loftus at UC Irvine and her colleagues, who constructed these clever experimental protocols in which they would plant a false memory of a childhood experience that never happened into an adult subject, who would then recount in great detail the memories of this event that never happened. It was quite startling to everybody that, in fact, we are quite capable of doing this. Although if you think about it, really, we are really good at concocting fantastic worlds and scenarios that are not true. It's called fiction. It's called fantasy. This is what, say, the Harry Potter series is all about. People are always amazed that somebody could come up with some fantastic story of, say, alien abductions or elaborate conspiracies. But in fact, non-fiction writers and fantasy writers and novelists and so on, they're really good at concocting these fantastic stories. You just make it up. And so that's the problem with repressed memories. And we know, of course, that the idea that trauma causes a memory to be pressed down is certainly not true for, say, violence. Holocaust survivors, returning veterans from war, they have the opposite problem. Not only can they not repress their memories, they get PTSD, and that's a problem. James Kihar asks, with Hitch and Stenger gone, he means Christopher Hitchens and Victor Stenger, and Dawkins and Dennett graying a bit, who do you see carrying the secularist torch forward in addition to you and Sam Harris? Then he signs off, keep the faith, which I presume is meant in fun. Well, there's tons of people, James, lots and lots of people out there of Dawkins and Dennett's age, my age, Sam's age. Sam's younger than me. I'm younger than Richard and Dan. And there's a whole generation coming up. In fact, the fastest growing group, as we've noted many times, are the nuns, the people that tick the box for no religious affiliation. Now, those aren't necessarily, that's a third of millennials. They're not necessarily atheist, agnostic, skeptics, but we know that amongst those, a sizable portion of millennials and younger are atheists and agnostics, much more many more than we thought. Perhaps a recent study I wrote about in Scientific American suggests that it could be as high as 25%, that is a quarter. Now, this is done through survey techniques in which we know that people lie on surveys. They self censor. They don't want to admit they're gay or atheist or whatever. And so people that study LGBTQ communities, for example, have devised these statistical techniques to show that, in fact, the community of LGBTQ may be much larger than we thought, simply because people are hesitant to say what they are thinking or feeling to a survey, even if it's anonymous. Yes, even if it's anonymous, this appears to be the case. So all of those people, millions, will step forward as the generations go. Just as a side, parenthetically, to those of you who have donated to the Skeptics Society, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. And when I'm gone, and my partner and the current generation running it, it will continue. We have a investment fund that supports it, and people will be hired to replace me and so on. It will continue. This is not the Michael Shermer show. It's the Science and Skepticism show, and that will continue. So keep the faith. Next category, God, Jesus, and religion. Nick Verster asks, I can prove that Jesus never was a human being. Can you? Well, Nick, I can't. And I'm not sure you can either. I think that is an article of faith. I think it can be argued that Jesus probably really existed as a person, as a human. People like Bart Ehrman, the great historian of religion, particularly Christianity, makes a pretty good case that someone named Jesus probably really did exist. But that's the kind of historical question that any historian could write about, argue about, research. But to go from there to say Jesus wasn't human, then what is he? He's a supernatural being. How could you prove through natural means something that's supernatural, outside of nature? I contend you can't. Same problem we have with miracles and any kind of supernatural or paranormal phenomenon. How can you really prove it in the same way you would some natural phenomenon? So the idea that Jesus was crucified, yes, that's a historical question. The Romans crucified people right and left. They crucified petty criminals. In fact, the two people that were put to death along with Jesus that day, they were common criminals, and crucifixion was fairly common. So that Jesus existed, was probably crucified, that part of the story is probably true. The next step, that he was resurrected and now he sits at the side of God, or he is God, or this whole problem of 3 in 1, 1 in 3, problem of identity, how could a natural being like a human be also God at the same time? Anyway, that's fraught with theological issues that I won't get into here, but that's a step I think you can't take within any realm of philosophy or science or reason, empiricism. I don't think it could be argued. Okay, another anonymous person says, hi, Michael. Most of my theist friends ask me the above question, proof that God doesn't exist, and dared that they will convert to atheism if I can give them proof. I told them many times that the burden of proof belongs to them to provide evidence of God's existence, but they don't buy it. My question is, what should I do? Will I just turn around and go away? Please help. Okay. The burden of proof argument is that the burden of proof is on the person making the claimant, not on the skeptic, not on the person listening to the claim. And I don't think you could prove God doesn't exist, but I think Victor Stenger, the aforementioned Victor Stenger, makes a pretty good case in several of his books. The one, The God Hypothesis, I think he makes a good case that if there was a God, the God that's described, the Judeo-Christian God, the monotheistic God, the God of Abraham, a supernatural being who created the universe, created life, created us, cares about us, and will grant us everlasting life, and so forth, that God. If that God really existed, the universe and the world should be a certain way, and it isn't. And Victor goes through a dozen different examples of the way the world should be if there was a God, and it isn't that way. Just the problem of evil is the biggest one of all that I've never read a good answer to, even when I was a Christian. at Pepperdine, I was always troubled by the problem of evil. It just seems an insurmountable problem. If God is real, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why does evil exist? Now, I'm not talking about wars and violence and things like that the Christian will say, well, that's human sin. People make free choices, they make bad free choices, and that's the result of the fall in the garden. Okay. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about innocent victims of evil, childhood leukemia, for example, or hurricanes and natural disasters, things like that. Cancer. Why should innocent people suffer like that? To me, that's a sign that either God, if he exists, is limited, is not that good, or just doesn't exist. And I think the latter one is most likely. Okay, Barbara Anderson has a question. I'm constantly defending whether God exists. They say, prove it. They also say the Bible is full of errors. They also question the 6th day and 1 day of rest to create the world. I tell them that 6 days and 1 day does not equal our time measure, in that 1,000,000 years might equal 1 day. I tell them that men did write the Bible as directed by God. Somewhere along the way, misinterpretations are probable, as in any recorded message when done by human hand. The proof part is darn hard to explain. Well, yes. Therefore, I ask them if they have ever heard any stories about the people worldwide who have died near-death experience and returned to life with virtually the same story of their experiences. That's difficult to refute. And then she signs off, how far off base have I been? I am going to have a lot of splaining to do should I make it that far into the afterlife. I sure don't need anything else to confess about. Jeez. How do I explain all the above without sounding like a Looney Tune? Barb from Topeka, Kansas. And she writes, P.S. Please do not delay. I will turn 81 in August, and I am on borrowed time. Barbara, we are all on borrowed time. So, as Hitch famously said when he was dying, you're all dying, to an audience I was sitting in. Yeah, that's true. That's right. So we're all on borrowed time. Congratulations to making it to 80, and hope you make it till August, and then you're 81. That's fantastic. As for how far off base you've been, well, that's a pretty natural sequence of arguments and beliefs that most Christians and believers in God make. In terms of the conflicts between science and biblical scripture, for example, one easy way around it is just to say the 6 days of creation are 6 geological epochs. They could be 1 billion years each or 100 million years each, whatever. There's no problem with that. In fact, William Jennings Bryan, in the Scopes trial, on the stand, said that it didn't have to be 6 literal days. So once you go down that path, it's much easier to rationalize religious doctrine and try to make it fit with science. Okay, fine. But at some point, why accept any of that? Because we know that the Bible is a wiki. It was written by a lot of different people, edited and pieced together over many centuries. So why think that it was handed down from on high and then filtered and edited and mistakes were made and so forth? Why go that route at all? Why not just treat it as a mythological book or part history, part myth, and read it as literature, and don't worry about the literal interpretation or some kind of conciliation with the findings of science. Ultimately, what you're after here is some kind of proof, and I don't think it's there. Proof of God, proof of the resurrection, proof that Jesus is God, and so on. I don't think any of that is possible using science or reason. If I did, I would believe, as I once did. But as a believer, I looked at the arguments on both sides and came to the conclusion that the arguments that the atheists made were better than those by the theists. So it's not Looney Tune, but it is, I think, not solid logic or empiricism to get you there. But so what's the point? Well, actually, that comes with another question coming up a little bit later that I'll get to. Okay, Robert Kingsbury asks, some people state that human beings have natural necessity to believe in supernatural powers like gods, pixies, Gandalf the Grey, or Harry Potter, so-called need and beliefs. I do know about some specific natural necessities of humans like speech, art, self-esteem, which were studied in many scientific researches in different disciplines, though I gave up to find a single mention of godlust or something like it anywhere except Soul Savers paperback brochures and websites of similar taste and so on. Anyway, what he's getting at here is, do humans need religion? Do we need to believe in God? Okay, I think religion's too big a word. What is it that people find in religion that's appealing? And it's the social aspect. So do humans need community? Do we need friendship? Do we need relationships with others? Yes, we do. That's a need, part of our human nature. And certainly religion is one way to get it. There are many other ways to get it. And religion is not even necessarily the best way to get it. So to that extent, I wouldn't say belief in God is like speech or art or self-esteem even. I think it's more like a maybe a spandrel, or it was co-opted for something else that we need. Belief in God, for example, that's what I call agenticity, the tendency to infuse our patterns that we find in nature with intentional agency. And that is invisible beings behind the scenes pulling the strings and running the show. That's pretty natural. But that explains not just God, but ghosts and aliens and angels and demons and witches and spirits and all kinds of things that are common. That part might be part of human nature. It probably is part of human nature, but not the Godhead or the monotheistic God or anything like that. Okay, here's another question. Anonymous person. There are reliable studies to indicate that religious people, those who believe in a higher power, are happier and tend to live longer than those who do not. As one who has struggled with depression most of my adult life, and as a former believer, Mormonism, I need every tool I can to to fight the demon of depression. Returning to belief is not an option. I've seen behind the curtain and recognize religion and, frankly, belief in God for what it is. There's no going back. However, surely there are evidence-based methods, alternatives, options for skeptics and atheists. Can you comment on this and provide accessible references? Okay, well, first of all, depression is almost assuredly a brain chemistry issue for particularly severe depression. Of course, it's perfectly normal to be depressed in response to traumatic events in life that may not have anything to do with abnormal brain chemistry. But we know there's tried and true techniques to deal with this, cognitive behavior therapy. There are certain medications that seem to work for some people for extreme depression. But from what I've seen, probably the best thing you can do is community, having friends, having people to talk to, having a social safety net, social community that is supportive. That seems to be one of the best things to deal with depression, having a relationship, somebody to talk to, and even leaving out cognitive behavior therapy, just psychotherapy, where you just sit on the proverbial couch and talk to people. It looks like from the evidence that just talking to a friend is as good as that, if not better. So you don't need to return to religion. There's no special system set up for skeptics and atheists. It's just whatever science says is the best treatment. So it would depend on how severe your depression is. Taking some medications can help for sure. For the extreme kind of depression, if just get you out of bed and up and out the door. But there's also other things: exercise, diet. Again, things that are in the common medical literature that I would recommend. Okay, so another one here. In Australia, we have just had a royal commission into child sexual abuse in churches and other institutions. The Catholic Church was by far the worst offender. Why is it that people continue to attend Mass and send their children to Catholic schools despite the reports of atrocious behavior of many priests and the efforts of the Church to hide and protect the perpetrators? Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know, because I wouldn't do it, but I wasn't raised Catholic. There's a huge, long tradition there. People get a lot out of church as a community, the music, the candles, the traditions, the ceremonies, the community with like-minded believers and so on, that make it easy to overlook these isolated instances and to think, well, those atrocities are happening somewhere else, not in my parish or not in my church. And I think cognitive dissonance kicks in there, and people just rationalize their way around that. Don Clark DAWN Don Clark asks, if you commit suicide, do you go to hell? If so, what is hell like? Well, Don, I'm sorry, I've never been, and I hope to never find out, I guess. Although, as Hitch famously said, the Christian heaven would be like celestial North Korea. A dictator that knows everything you're thinking doesn't sound very heavenly to me, so I suppose hell would be something like that. I think there's a reason most religions do have prescriptions against suicide, and they do talk about you're going to hell if you do commit suicide. This is just a way of trying to curb the problem. We have more research now. I have a salon coming up with a psychologist that just wrote a book on suicide, Jesse Baring, called Suicidal. It comes out in the fall. And he has, summarizes all the research on suicide. There's a lot we don't know, and it's very difficult to predict. Okay, hello, I'm a doctor physician from India, Hindu by religion, and recently turned agnostic and skeptic. Congratulations. My question is, why all prophets and saints of different religions, especially Hinduism and Sufism, claim to see God in higher consciousness state, trance state, if there is no God? And it goes on and on about how this happens through meditation and so on. Yes, that's entirely possible. That, of course, people in other traditions have completely different concepts of what the Godhead is like. In Hinduism and Sufism and Buddhism and so on, this is not at all the monotheistic God of Abraham. So if you define God as this state of mind, and then you set a set of criteria for what it takes to get to that state of mind, say you have to meditate for 18 straight hours staring into a candle or something like that, and you will then lose your sense of self and so on, and that's God. Okay, then it's entirely possible people can say, yes, I met God, or I am God, or I achieved the God state, or something like that through meditation. Yes, people can do that. But in the West, of course, that's not what most people think of when they think of God. In any case, I would just, as a psychologist, say that's just nothing more than describing an internal state through introspection, and it is nothing more than just the brain doing what the brain does, and we call it mind. Speaking of which, next category, free will. I'm always amazed people just are so interested in this subject. The problem is evident from the definitions in themselves. How can the universe be determined? And we also make free choices, and this is restricted by the nature of language. So Austin writes, let's see, given that conscious qualia take 0.3 to 0.5 seconds to be structured and produced by subconscious neural activity, wouldn't it be that what we take to be experiences in the now have already happened, including decisions? You are still you, but conscious causation is out. Libertarians trying to rescue free will, here he means free will libertarians, not political libertarians, by changing it to that it could have been different because randomness is the bedrock of reality, which it does appear to be, fail to realize that the person doesn't control the random event that may cause an outcome to be different. That's right. So Dan Dennett made this point a long time ago, decades ago, in one of his early books. I think it was in The Kind of Free Will Worth Having, or something like that. I forget the name of that book. Elbow Room. It was called Elbow Room. That quantum indeterminacy does not give you free will. It just throws in an element of randomness into brain firing, and therefore it gives you even less control. So it's the opposite of moving from determinism toward freedom. I've written about this so many times I don't even know where to begin. First of all, behaviorally, nobody's a determinist. No one walks around in a state of zombie-like robotic motions wondering what they're going to do next. Is it the left foot? Is it the right foot? Should I look? I shouldn't even bother to look left or right at the street and so on. People assume. It feels like we have free will. We make free decisions. Of course the universe is determined. Of course your actions and thoughts are determined by preconditions. Yes, that's right. But in short, because I've written a lot on this and I don't want to beat it to death, but what makes us different from, say, rocks and clouds and even most other animals, is that all other animals, let's be blunt, we're aware of the conditions influencing us, causing our behavior, and we can change them. In other words, we're self-aware. We're aware that these things influence us, and therefore we are part of the causal net. Our very decisions that we make change the preconditions of what's going to happen next. So we are each of us within a causal net of a determined universe, yes, but we can change the variables, the vectors in the net pushing us down the pathway, and we can, to a certain extent, control some of that. Of course, we're restricted by nature and nurture and so on, but just any of the books on free will and self-control will show you how to do this. If you're go shopping when you're hungry, you're more likely to buy foods that are not as healthy for you. Knowing that, eat something before you go food shopping. These kinds of things. The whole idea of these behavioral choice paradigms set up, say at restaurants where the healthier foods are at the beginning of the menu, or putting caloric content of each food item. These are ways of manipulating your own behavior. The restaurant's trying to help you along, of course, because the state told them they have to. But you can do it yourself, of course, and that's being part of the causal net and having some volition. Anyway, that's the sort of the short version of it. There might be some other questions here that trigger some other ideas. Jeff Flanzer asks, what else is there besides nature and nurture? Do nature and nurture make up the whole pie? If so, doesn't that view alone contradict any argument for free will? Can we be conscious as in knowing that something is going on, yet not consciously choosing as in free will? He says, I see it as a read-only consciousness versus the editable version, from Jeff from Ojai, California. A neighbor here of mine. Okay, so yes, I guess I'm just repeating what I just said. Yes, nature and nurture makes up the whole pie except for the quantum indeterminacy and the part of randomness that doesn't give us free will. But being conscious of that, of those vectors, allows us to do something about it. And that's what we call volition or free will. Anyway, enough of that. Category Jordan Peterson, of course. Dionysus, that's their real name. I'm reading Maps of Meaning for the second time, being careful to understand everything. I believe that the depth of the book, regardless of agreement or disagreement, makes works such as the one in Harris's Moral Landscape seem like a student essay in terms of engagement with the subject matter, as well as regarding the presentation of scientific evidence. Since you have been listening, I would love to know what you think. Yes, he's responding to my tweet last week that I've started listening to Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, his first book. Excuse me. I read 12 Steps. And that book is super simple. That would be what he calls a student essay equivalent compared to Maps of Meaning, which is very dense. I've actually given up listening to it while I'm out cycling. It's too deep. It's too dense. If indeed that's what it is. His critics say it's nonsense. I don't think it's nonsense. There's a lot of good stuff in there that I've gotten so far, but it takes a lot to sort of sit and think about. Each sentence is pretty much packed with a lot of content, and you have to think about it slowly. And it's a long book. It's 30 hours of listening at normal speed, 24 hours at 1.25 speed, which is what I listen to books at. I don't think it's fair to describe Sam Harris's Moral Landscape as a student essay at all. Sam's style of writing is much more succinct than Jordan's. Sam gets straight to the point. He doesn't have a lot of these rambling, parenthetical sidebars like Steve Gould used to have, which are interesting and fun, but he gets straight to the point. And I think the economy of words is a value, particularly in the current culture with so many competing sources of content, that it's really hard to carve out enough time to devour a 30-hour book. So I'll let you know later if I finish Maps of Meaning. I'm totally not a Jungian, Freudian type thinker at all. I'm not into Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn. Any of these authors that Jordan Peterson really loves, I don't read them. So it's hard for me to wrap my mind around it. I read mostly science. Soren Hemmingsen asks, what do you think of Jordan Peterson's use of the Bible and his understanding of religion? Even with no God, might there be some value in this? Yes. I find it interesting that when someone asks me if I believe in God, I just say no. Yes, Jordan Peterson, if he believes in God, he says, that would take me 40 hours. Okay, so there's one difference between us. He's got many of these long YouTube videos on the Bible. I tried to listen to one. I queued up Genesis because I've read Genesis. I've studied Genesis. I know the book pretty well. And on a long drive from Chapman University back to my home in Santa Barbara, that's about 2.5 hours, I queued it up, listened to the whole thing, and as I was pulling into my driveway, he said, now, let's start and look at Genesis 1:1. What was he doing? He was all the backdrop to the meaning of stories and myths and language and vocabulary and words, the whole methodology of mythology and religious studies and so on. That's all fine. That's what he does. But for me, it was just too big of a commitment. If it takes you 2.5 hours just to get to Genesis 1:1, oh boy, I'm not that interested in the Bible. Okay. Next category, human nature. Peter Burghardt asks, humanity exhibits a very wide range of behavioral quality, from the most despicable and dishonorable that one can imagine to highly honorable and exemplary. What is the one most important strategy that you would employ to move this ugly balance in the righteous direction? And related to this, Ron Shaw from Perth, Australia asks, why do people cheat and lie? And Mirza Ashraf asks, is human behavior by nature are humans by nature homicidal animal and warmonger, or is it a learned behavior? And Ludwig Rahl asks, if we include animals in our calculus, wouldn't it be true to say that violence has increased in the last century? Okay, I'll come back to that because he's dealing with Pinker's book and my book, The Moral Arc. Let me address this. Okay, so we are by nature good and evil. We have inner demons. We have better angels. It's way too simple to ask, are we good or evil or good or bad? Why do people cheat and lie? Because they can, because we are partially selfish. But a more interesting question is, why don't people cheat and lie all the time? Because we don't. We know, for example, from Dan Ariely's research on lying, that people lie when they lie. They exaggerate, they lie about 10 to 15%. I say that because the protocol that Dan set up is subjects complete this little task, something like a Sudoku puzzle. And they do as many as they can, and they get like $1 for each one right. And then they're given something like 15 minutes. They do this alone in a room, and then in two different conditions. One condition, they're told to shred the answer sheet and then go outside the room and tell the experimenter how many they got right, and then they're paid like $1, a correct answer, something like that. In the second condition, subjects complete the task and just bring the sheet out and hand it to the experimenter, who then counts them up and gives them $1 for each one right. So the shredding the answer sheet condition is the chance for lying condition. And the ones that are in that condition exaggerated about 10 to 15% of how many they got right. So this is the idea, and Dan has a whole book about this, other conditions, other experiments, and so on, that we exaggerate, lie, cheat just a little bit. Not, and by we, I mean most people. I don't mean the 1 to 3% of humans that are psychopaths, sociopaths, 1% of women or so, 3% of men. I'm not talking about those. I'm just talking about just regular people walking around, your friends and neighbors, family members, and so on. Everybody lies and cheats a little bit. And we know this in research on resumes and online profiles. People exaggerate how much they make, how tall they are, how much they weigh, and so on. Just a bit. Okay, now why this happens? This has to do with our nature. That is, starting with Richard Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene. Not that genes are selfish, but that if you are a gene and your goal is to get yourself into the next generation, what do you got to do? Well, at some point you have to construct a self-replicating mechanism, like a whole double helix type thing, but you also have to be inside of some container, a cell, and ultimately some kind of vehicle. So what we call vehicles are animals or organisms, from cells to people. And now, ideally, of course, you want to maximize energy capture in your environment by grabbing as many calories as you can, say, per day, by protecting yourself from predators as best you can, and so forth. The problem is that all organisms are like that. So if you're in a social group, if there's other selfish vehicles in your social group, they're going to be making the same calculation as you. And you know that you are going to make this calculation and so on, even if you're not self-consciously aware of this, because all animals do this. So at some point you have to curb your enthusiasm, shall we say, for lying and cheating and hoarding all the resources, because this is going to lead to conflict. That is, somebody else in the group is not going to let you have all the resources, and you will be punished for this. So this is called moralistic punishment. That is, you will be punished for being too selfish, for cheating too much, for lying too much. And we know from a ton of research on this that there's this delicate balance between I want what's best for me and I know everybody else wants what's best for them, so it pays for me to be nicer to them. So in other words, the evolution of the moral sense of cooperation, of altruism and reciprocal altruism is there by the logic of natural selection. Okay, so that's a short description of a book-length treatment of this subject, not just by me, but by many others. A whole field of study of evolutionary ethics on this. And but I should say parenthetically that it's not enough to just say, I'm going to pretend and fake being a nice, cooperative, altruistic person, and then when no one's looking, I'm going to cheat, steal, and stab people in the back, and so on. The problem with that is we're also fine-tuned to look for cheaters and people that are not genuine and honest. And therefore, we have to cultivate the reputation of being actually a good person, a moral person, a decent person, a just person, a loving, caring person. And when you do that, you can't fake it, because if you fake it, you're going to give off behavioral cues that you are lying, because other people are sensitive to this. So if you believe the lie, so to speak, then it's not a lie. That is, if you actually believe you're a moral person, you feel it, you act as if other people do matter and that you do care about them, that's genuine morality. That's genuine friendship. That's genuine love, and so on. You don't have to fake it. And so my argument in The Science of Good and Evil and more, so in the Moral Arc, is that that we evolved a deep and real objective moral sense. Objective in the sense that theists want. They want God to have come down from on high and plopped in a neural network or a unit, a moral module into the brain. We don't need that. We have it by the logic of natural selection. Okay, somebody asks about, I mentioned Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, my book, The Moral Arc. What about the abuse of animals and factory farming? Isn't this a decline of progress? Is moral decline? Isn't this an increase in violence? Yes, of course. But as Steve points out in his chapter on animal rights, that the way animals used to be treated centuries ago is just abysmal. You know, cat bear baiting and cat head-butting cats, and cockfighting, and some of these things still go on, like bullfighting, but they're on the way out. That is, our intuitions based on our knowledge about cognition, brains, minds, and the connectedness we have with all animals through evolution means we're more likely to project our empathies into an organism and not want to commit suffering on them, commit pain. So, yes, we have a ways to go. I think in terms of the future of moral progress I deal with in the last chapter of the Moral Arc, animal rights, that's one of the next big ones. And after that, AI rights, robot rights. Okay, the future of humanity. Emons Vilks writes, how to avoid destroying conditions of human existence on Earth. Is it possible? Not slogans, please. Real proposals. And what is the sense of human existence on a cosmological scale? What is the main value of human existence? Okay, yes, there are potentially some existential threats, although not the usual ones. I'm not worried about terrorism and as an existential threat, even if terrorists managed to detonate a dirty bomb or a nuke in New York City and killed millions of people, it's not like the president's going to turn the keys over to ISIS, to the White House, and say the country is yours. Nothing any terrorist could do could result in the extinction of the species, which is usually what we mean by existential threat. Nuclear war is a concern, but conditions are much better than they used to be. We've gone from about 80,000 nuclear weapons to about 8,000 nuclear weapons, a 90% decrease in the number of nuclear weapons. That's progress. Now, it's still, thousands too many. If we had under 1,000, that would make nuclear winter very unlikely. So, that's really the only one. I'm not worried about AI. Global warming is globally threatening, but I don't think existentially as a threat. But I think continuing on working toward nuclear zero and continuing on reducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we've been doing, we need to do more of that, I think, and sooner the better. I say we have much progress that we've already seen in both of those areas, and it's getting better. Let's see, Donna asks, where do you see our society in the future, let's say in 10 years? More divisive or less divisive? The pendulum always swings. Yes, it does. More divisive at the moment. In the long run, less divisive. It depends on your time scale. The longer out you look and back you go, the more you can see that real progress has happened. If you just follow the headlines instead of the trend lines, things look pretty bad, I will admit. Still, I'm pretty optimistic. I think that the current administration and all the controversy they've caused, yes, these are all things worth staying on top of and combating where appropriate. I do think that the Constitution is working. The checks and balances that are in place for a good reason, and they're working. So this, too, is a test, I think, of our constitutional democracy. Rahat Mojib asks, given global warming is bad for the future of the Earth, why should one care? Okay, well, we should care because, first of all, it will affect us. Maybe if you're 90 now, it won't, but I'm 63. I feel like it could affect me. So selfishly, yes, we should do something about it. But of course, I have kids, and my kids will have kids, and we should care about the future of the species, future generations, and of course, animals, and so on. So we should do something about it. We are doing something about it, and so that's why we should care. Let's see, John Lean asks, is there any point in aggressive attempts to curb global warming if there is not a concomitant effort to reduce or at least stabilize the human population? Yes, of course, these are related, John, but the good news is the population will top out around 2050 at around 10 billion at most. These are UN projections, and by 2100, if you take not conservative, just sort of the middle between conservative and extreme positions in the middle, by 2100 it could be back down to about where we are now, and then by say 2200 it could be down to a billion or two people, and by then we'll have, of course, the technology of synthetic meat and so on, so get rid of factory farming and all the accompanying technologies that pour greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, like say all electric cars, and the electricity charging up those cars is generated by nuclear power plants or through other solar and geothermal and other sources of energy, so that we get off fossil fuels. I think all of that's coming, and I think it will be in time. I'm not worried about overpopulation. Already in many countries on Earth, they have an underpopulation problem. Their populations are shrinking, and that will continue to happen in other countries as women get educated, women get empowered, women control family size, and in general, the more prosperous a society, the slower their population growth. So ultimately, economic prosperity and education and rights are the answer to overpopulation. Okay, wrapping it up here with our miscellaneous category. BJ Nicholson asks, on a Joe Rogan podcast, you mentioned ADHD in a passing way. Your comments seem to indicate you either did not understand the condition or did not think medication was appropriate for those diagnosed. What is your opinion of ADHD? What is your level of understanding of the condition? It's an area ripe for discussion. Yes. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, is, I'm not an expert on this at all, but in my opinion, there's too much, there's over-medication problem. Not that the medications don't work, they do work, they can work to curb hyperactive behavior, but of course this is a spectrum. Not everybody needs the same levels of medication, and there are other cognitive behavioral techniques that can work in more modest cases, moderate cases. My fear is that the medications are used as a technology to simply curb behavior when you don't want or have the time to do something about it through these cognitive behavior techniques that do work. Anyway, that's my short opinion on ADHD. Bruce Neben asks, if the universe is expanding, what exactly is expanding? For example, is the distance between galaxies expanding only? Is the space between objects in our solar system expanding? Is the space between molecules expanding, atoms, and so on? No. The universe is expanding. It's not expanding into anything. The space itself is part of the universe, and the space and the stuff in it are all expanding. So distances between galaxies is expanding, not between all galaxies. For example, the Milky Way galaxy, our galaxy, and Andromeda are actually moving toward each other. And in several billion years, they will collide. Okay. But not anywhere else. Not in the solar system. The galaxy itself is not expanding apart. The space between molecules and atoms is not expanding. What are your thoughts on capital punishment, writes Terry Somerville from Portage, Michigan. He says he's against it because police officers, prosecutors, judges, and jury members are human beings and humans make mistakes. I also wonder whether some murderers want to die. 40 years in a max security prison is the best punishment for them. I used to be a supporter of capital punishment. I thought it was justified based on my sympathies for the families of the victim. I've changed my mind on that for several reasons. One is that the rate of improper judicial trying and conviction and incarceration of people is too high. The Innocence Project, for example, is exonerated. I forget what the number is these days, 200 and something people that were on death row. They were going to be put to death, and later DNA testing of, say, rape kits showed that they were not the person. So these are people who would have been put to death by the state wrongly. I think that number is too high. We do know that there's a lot of corruption. We know there's still some racism in police departments in certain states in particular. We know that juries and judges are not rational calculators. They're humans. And we know from research, for example, that if it's in the morning or the afternoon, depending on what time the judge had breakfast or lunch and so on, all these affect decisions that are made about what somebody's fate is in the criminal justice system. Okay, it's too subjective. Also, I think it doesn't work as a deterrent of crime. I mean, most crimes are committed not by rationally calculating robots that are trying to decide what's the best way to say, gain access to more wealth or prosperity or stuff. No, most of it's moralization. It's, spur of the moment. It's, crimes of passion and honor killings and violence and fights at bars. Alcohol is often involved. And these are the kinds of things that the death penalty has zero effect on. And so it doesn't work. And then finally, as a civil libertarian, as a classical liberal, I don't think the state should have that much power. That's too much power over life and death. But in terms of the sympathy for the families of the victims, Terry is correct that life in prison is a pretty miserable experience. If you think they should be punished, that's pretty good punishment. But that's a whole other subject. I don't think that's such a good idea either. I think restorative justice more than retributive justice is appropriate. Don't necessarily let them out, but work to restore the justice, the harm done. Michael Enright asks, why do people fall for medical quackery? It's usually, Michael, in instances where modern medicine doesn't have a solution. So where we don't have a cure for, say, autism, that opens the door to any and all quacks to come in and proffer their different theories and therefore cures. It's less likely in cases where we do have tried and true methods. And so cancer, for example, a lot of cancers, there's very little we can do about. And so cancer quackery is big in those particular areas. George Nanoski asks, can freedom of speech ever become a dangerous thing if a majority of the populace becomes incapable of distinguishing between subjective and objective information when making decisions regarding politics, policy, and law? Well, yes, it could be a problem. Of course, we like to think we can have an educated, rational, voting populace. We know that's something of a myth. But the idea that we can determine who really understands information and who doesn't, and therefore we should curb some kind of speech and not others, is a very dangerous road to go down. Who's going to do it? You, me? We're going to set up a committee to decide which speech is acceptable and which is not. This is always a bad idea. So, and in any case, the only way to find out if you're wrong is by talking to other people, and to find out if ideas are good or not is to expose them to the marketplace of debate and disputation to see how well they stand.